Hi and welcome. My name is Cassidy Perkins. I'm an account executive at Reuben Rink. I wanted to welcome everybody to our latest virtual webinar, QR Codes Are Back, where we are going to discuss the best practices for implementing these handy codes into your marketing strategy. If you're not familiar with us, Reuben Rink is a full-service advertising agency. We are based in downtown Winston-Salem, North Carolina. We're hosting this webinar series to help keep our clients and our contacts informed about all the latest that's going on in the marketing and advertising world. If you have any questions for us during the presentation, please drop them into the chat feature, as I just mentioned, and we are going to answer those at the end. We'll have about a 15-minute window for Q&A following the presentation. Thanks again for joining us. So today I am at a local cafe in Winston-Salem, and I am going to take advantage of a QR code we're likely all familiar with, the digital menu. All right. Now, while I decide between a pumpkin spice latte or a pumpkin cold brew, I'm going to send it over to the team over at the Reuben Rink office. Today, our Digital Services Director, Ian Joyce, and our President, J.G. Wolf, will be hosting the presentation. Oh, and stay until the very end to learn how you can enter to win a refreshing giveaway from Reuben Rink. Take it away, Ian.
Thank you, Cassidy. I'm going to start out today by talking a little bit about the history of QR codes and the technology behind them, and some of the early marketing efforts that involve QR codes. The Japanese global manufacturing company Denso created QR codes in the quite a number of years ago to use in manufacturing. If, particularly in an enterprise like automobile manufacturing, where there are very complex parts and assemblies that have to be tracked, Denso found that barcodes, which were the standard, didn't hold enough information and were in many cases too difficult to read or introduced errors into the tracking process. And so they explored alternatives and invented the QR code. QR codes were great in manufacturing environments because you could scan them in any orientation, unlike barcodes where you struggle to align that reader with the code. You could simply point a reader 360 degrees around the code and it would read it. QR codes contained a lot more data than barcodes. And then very importantly, because this was developed in Japan, it could accommodate Japanese language characters. So in terms of the technical details and the features of QR codes, we tend to think of them as just sort of generically QR codes. We're familiar with the image that we see at the top right of the screen, this series of dots, but there's actually quite a bit more to these than just that. There are 5 basic types of QR codes. And then within that, there are 40 different versions of QR codes. Now, the exact version that you use depends on a number of things. It depends on the amount of data that you need to store. It depends on how much data correction you need. And when I talk about data correction, what I'm referring to is the ability for a scanner to read the code if part of it is obscured, whether just visually or in the case of Cassidy's Cafe, because the code has had something spilled on it. That factors in, but essentially, the more data you have, the more modules you need to have, or those little dots, which means the larger the QR code. And among these 40 different versions, they're on a spectrum. They vary from 21 by 21 modules, and the module is the black dot, or the black square, up to the 40th version, which is 177 by 177 modules. So there are 3 components to a QR code. There are these sort of concentric squares in 3 areas, and those are position detection patterns. That's what allows the QR code to be read in different orientations. There's the data area, which is simply the white space that contains the modules, or those black squares. So, and the base unit of a QR code is that module. Now, there aren't any standardized sizes. You can make a QR code as small as about 2 by 2 centimeters. And as you'll see in one of our examples, there's really no maximum size. As long as the printer can clearly print the module, and as long as it's readable by either a dedicated reader or a smartphone, you can make it as really as small or as large as it needs to be. So in terms of the features of a QR code, we talked a little bit about how it's readable 360 degrees in any direction. It contains a lot of data. It's got the same data capacity as a barcode, but at 1/10 the size. And then what you store on it can actually be, it's quite versatile in terms of storage. You can put text on it, you can put images, sound, you know, it's very versatile in that respect. And then, as I mentioned, it's got the ability to include error correction. So this came from the fact that it was used in manufacturing, and it might be in environments where the QR code could get damaged or might be obscured by something that is spilled on it or by dirt. But nowadays in marketing, that's helpful, because if you put a QR code out in the wild, it's not necessarily going to remain intact. And so that ability to continue to be read is important. And then codes can be divided into multiple QR codes, or multiple codes can be combined into one. And, you know, we think of these as squares, but you could take this square that's up in the top right, and you could actually divide that into up to 16 individual QR codes. So for example, if you had an area that is horizontal, where you had to include the code, you could do that so that area would accommodate it. In the same way, you could take 16 codes and combine them into one. And then finally, QR codes are very customizable. They can be branded. There's a lot you can change in terms of the appearance of them, colors, use of logos. So it's a very versatile format. And of course, you know, when these were launched, marketers saw them as an opportunity, and they gravitated to them, and unfortunately, not always with the best results. And there were a number of reasons for that. When QR codes first appeared in marketing and advertising, there were some technical obstacles. The first of which is that unless you worked in manufacturing, you probably had no idea what you were looking at. And so you would see this code, and your reaction to it would be to say, well, what's that? So consumers didn't know how to use them, didn't know what to do with them, didn't know how to respond to them. And then on top of that, smartphones lacked native QR code readers. So if you were one of those rare individuals who knew what a QR code was, you would have to go find a QR code reader, load it onto your phone via downloading an app, and only then could you scan it. So aside from those technical obstacles, there was a lot of poor marketing strategy and execution that went on. Unfortunately, brands often use them to look tech savvy. It was really shorthand for we're a company that knows about technology. And so, for example, in this case with Bank of America on Facebook, we've got a QR code in place of an image. They're using a QR code to basically look tech savvy when a simple link could have done the trick. To make it worse, this code, if you followed it, only led to a home page. So they weren't necessarily leveraged in a way that took advantage of QR codes' advantages. And then the placement wasn't always optimal. So if you look at our example of the subway, how many of us are really going to want to get close enough to look at this QR code or scan the QR code that's down in the bottom left corner of this this tourism poster? You certainly don't want to sacrifice your safety to do that. So placement was also often a problem. And then in the case of the map example, it was simply a case of, again, using a QR code to do something that could have been done much more simply, where you simply could have shown people a map if that was the right solution. So marketers, aside from dealing with problems with adoption, simply weren't thinking through how to best use them. So with that, I'm going to pass the ball over to JG, who's going to talk a little bit about what is happening with QR codes now in marketing.
Let me start again. Sorry about that. Everybody, thanks, Ian. I appreciate it. The big thing here is to make the point that QR codes have not gone away. So you see on our screen here that it says, don't call it a comeback. And that's true even in marketing. There's been a decline, but they certainly have not gone away, even based on some of the poor uses that Ian just highlighted. But the situation is such that the COVID-19 pandemic, as it's really affected everything on a daily basis for us, also has then affected a desire for folks to be interested in applying QR codes again. And really in this day of what we think of as touchless interactions, you see this on a daily basis, that really aligns with use of QR codes and has sparked a demand then for use of QR codes again. That's one reason. The other big reason is that readers are now integrated in smartphones. So to Ian's earlier point, no longer do you have to download an app to be able to interact with QR codes and scan them, but instead you can just simply use the camera on your smartphone to proceed. So you see in the photo here, obviously restaurants are one huge success story and integration and use of QR codes. In the context of restaurants, they allow for elimination of menus, that have to be sanitized and reused. It kind of eliminates that altogether. It also then allows for information that's quickly changing. Some great examples of that might be hours that change from day to day with restaurants based on availability. It could have to do with menu items, product availability. It could also have to do with fluctuating hours, which I mentioned, but also prices. Savvy restaurants out there recognizing that demands might fluctuate throughout the course of the day or on certain days. And QR codes give them the ability to flexibly change prices as well as hours and other things, kind of on the fly. And then lastly, for restaurants, of course, it eliminates the printing costs associated with menus. So there's some cost savings there too. So it's easy to see why restaurants have adopted use of QR codes for menus. Other industries have also leveraged the use of QR codes as well, and smart marketers have realized the opportunities associated, especially leverage data that can be gained from QR code use, and that data can be used to understand consumer preferences and behaviors. So Ian, if you could advance us. Thank you. I do want to touch on, importantly here, some best practices that are out there for use of a QR code. A QR code is a tool, and like any tool or anything you're doing, you've got to take time to determine the best tool for the job. The QR code is not the best tool for every job, but it works great in some circumstances. And so it's very important to determine a clear purpose. And the example here that we've got on screen, this happens to be a in-lobby poster for a legacy. And in this example, we're using a QR code for someone to begin the process of a plan and hearing from someone to proceed with a financial plan. On this particular case, the code itself takes the place of a very lengthy URL because the page that folks are being taken to is pretty deep on the Legacy's website. And so in this case, the QR code smartly bypasses the need to print out a lengthy URL for someone to remember or jot down. This also is a good example of the next point, which is that the call to action needs to be very clear and direct when using QR codes. In this case, it's a very simple call to action: scan this code, begin the first step of the process. The point there is to ask audiences to do one thing and be very clear about the value to them and what that thing is. Another best practice cannot be overlooked, and that has to do with optimizing the interaction for mobile. So clearly you're asking someone to interact with this code using a mobile device. The worst thing you can then do is lead them to a page or a document or something else that is not mobile optimized. You can imagine that would be a little frustrating. So you have to be sure wherever you're taking them works very well for mobile devices, and you got to do testing along those lines, of course. So with a wide range of QR code types and versions available, there's some things that you need to think about doing as you plan for use. One has to do with exactly where it will appear and the real estate on which it will be applied. There are other things like the amount of data that it contains, the error correction protocols and requirements associated with it, how it might be printed, and then design and branding needs. So when you have the opportunity to incorporate branding associated with the QR code. Last couple best practices. One is testing. I mentioned it, but it's critical. Big brands out there have made the mistake of pushing out QR codes that send visitors to embarrassing websites. Don't join that crowd. You don't want to be part of it. Next, you want to be careful to place codes in places where people can easily read them. The earlier example that Ian shared of the subway car was, by and large, a poor example of that, where you, again, might be putting somebody's safety in jeopardy based on placement of that code. So it's very important to watch that. Another example might be, a poor application would be something like placing a QR code on an outdoor billboard when you're speeding by at 70 miles an hour in your car. You certainly don't want to be taking a moment to scan a code on the way by. So there's some pretty obvious examples of that, but they're examples that you see QR codes applied to. Last point here is to consider your data collection and be sure you have a strategy around that. Certainly you should be using data captured from QR codes, and it is abundant, to improve on products or services, or to improve upon the next point of interaction that you have the opportunity with your customer. Forms are an important component of this. So form and data capture is a typical component of where you might be leading someone to. Again, coming back to the example on screen, in this particular case, beginning this process of finding out more information about a financial plan ended with a data capture form that then fed information, allowed for follow-up. All right, so it's always fun to see real examples of some best practices. And we just pulled 3 or 4 here we thought were pretty cool that we wanted to share today. There are a lot out there. And actually, we're always very intrigued and interested in hearing about applications, good applications of QR codes. So if you have good examples, don't be shy about dropping those in the comments. But there are 3 or 4 here we want to show. First, in the top left, you'll see here an example where Cygames and Billy used over 1,500 drones to create a huge QR code in the sky. This was part of a celebration for a game release anniversary. And scanning the code took audiences to a download page where they could download the game, which is pretty neat application for sure. In the upper right, this is an example of the Diageo Father's Day campaign. So the spirits manufacturer produced this campaign whereby buyers could record a personal video message and then using an app, and then the orders were fulfilled to dad with a QR code associated on the label. And you kind of see it here in this example. The dad could then scan that label and have the ability to hear a personal video message that was associated with it for Father's Day, which is a very nice personal touch. On the lower left, you see an example here of Klarna that created a censored, if you will, fashion show. This featured models who kind of came down the runway, and what they had on was just plain robes with huge QR codes attached to them. And so those folks interacting, many of whom were doing this virtually or at arm's length, had the ability to scan the code to then reveal the outfits. So just kind of a creative way to impart information. Last thing, the bottom right, our collective uses QR codes in a number of ways to share information about garments. So this is anything from cleaning information to supply chain information to tips on extending the life of garments and recycling suggestions. There's lots of great content contained, and you see that printed right on the tag. So scan me, pretty cool. Okay, we also here just wanted to show 3 or 4 what we consider helpful resources, and this presentation will go out to you at the end of the webinar, so you can check back in on this. We've got resources here for kind of lots of Q&A and detailed information about QR codes. We've got a link to a recent blog post that we wrote about QR codes. We've got one here on best practices, and we also have a really slick generator link, one that we've used. So keep an eye out for that, for the presentation coming, and you can check those out at your leisure. All right, I think now we've kind of moved through things pretty quickly because we did want to leave time for questions. I'm going to pass the mic back to Cassidy, and I think we've been fielding some questions here. So she's going to take over and walk us through that. We'll do our best to address your questions today. Cassidy, you're up.
All right, thanks, JG. So yeah, we've got a few minutes to take your questions. If you haven't already, feel free to drop any questions that you might have thought of during the presentation into that chat window. But we've got a couple that we are ready to answer here. So a question that we've gotten frequently about QR codes is, what are the best channels for QR code usage, whether that being analog or digital? And in our experience, QR codes often serve to bridge the gap between, interacting in real world settings and digital interaction. So for the most part, these are most functional when you put them out in the world to initiate digital contact with your consumers. So this would be on things like billboards and printed ads. Unfortunately, incorporating QR codes into digital spaces can be difficult. We also had a question about whether or not you should use QR codes in things like social media posts. And the difficulty there is typically if you're viewing these, you're already using a screen or a device. So it can be difficult, if you've got Facebook pulled up on your computer, then you're having to pull out your phone and scan and interact on a separate device. So these do work best in kind of analog settings, real world settings, to bring your customer into a digital interaction with your brand. Another kind of related, oh, go ahead.
Hey, Cassie, I would just like to add to that. When you're thinking of a digital application, it's this question about digital versus physical application of QR codes. One rule of thumb is that if you can achieve what you're trying to achieve by way of a quick link, there oftentimes is not the need then to generate a QR code, aside from perhaps this idea that it makes a bit of a technical impression, although I think that's probably a thing of the past. If it's just as easy in digital application for you to place a link, you can bypass the need for a QR code altogether. So that's just another consideration, I think, along the lines of what you're bringing up.
Absolutely. And this also applies to the question about social media. Typically, if your consumer or customer is already interacting with your social media, there will be opportunities to link to the pages that you want them to visit. On social media, that might mean, using the link in bio feature on Instagram or incorporating the link directly into your post's caption. So along kind of that same vein, we received a question about, can you scan a QR code from within a mobile browser? This is currently still a hurdle. There are tools for this, including Google. Google has integrated Google Lens into Chrome. So if you're using the Chrome browser, this allows you to scan codes within the browser. But in our experience, this doesn't always work. It's still a little bit buggy. So yeah, again, if that brings it back to the best use being analog or real life settings.
Cassidy, we've got a question that has come in about, it's a follow-up to my earlier comment about the size of QR codes. Essentially it's saying that they've gotten a recommendation that they shouldn't be printed any smaller than about 3/4 of an inch square and preferably 1 inch square. The 2 by 2 centimeter minimum size that I mentioned earlier is a little smaller than an inch square. There's nothing about that that's really set in stone. It's that the printing technology that's used needs to be sufficient to make the module readable. So high quality printing allows you to use a smaller QR code. But if you're printing, for example, I don't think any of us would do this, but if we're printing on a lower quality or consumer type printer, you're typically going to need need a QR code that's larger than one that you might be able to use for something that's commercially printed or printed on a very high resolution laser printer.
Yeah, I'd add to that. The question may revolve around print ads specifically, and if so, there can be a wide range and quite a bit of difference, to Ian's point, about quality and resolution reproduction, even across print applications. If you think of a slick, glossy, high-res magazine publication versus a local newspaper, for instance, there's quite a bit of difference there. So I think that 2 centimeter guide that Ian relayed earlier is probably a pretty good one to kind of stick to. My friend Google just told me that 2 centimeters is 0.787 inches. So the question here was asking about printing any smaller than an inch. And so that inch size is probably a pretty good guideline to stick to, although that, depending on the size of your print ad in that case, it could be a large portion of your ad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the other factor that you need to keep in mind is that size assumes that everything will fit within the modules that are defined for version 1 of a QR code. If, for example, you were trying to include a lot more data, for example, something that is image or sound based, then you're going to need to go to a larger QR code to accommodate the number of modules that are needed. I see we got another one in that is, can you put a logo in front of the QR code? Absolutely. And when we get to our drawing sweepstakes, you'll see an example of that.
Absolutely. Yeah, that brings me to another question that we received about kind of the flexibility you have with the design of these codes. And depending on the generator that you're using, you do have a lot of flexibility when it comes to making your QR code unique or stand out. So the most common design tools that are used are changing the color. As long as there is high contrast between the background and the modules, it can still be readable, but you can play around and use your brand's color palette. You can also, as Ian mentioned, add things like a logo to the center. You can use different shapes. I've got an example here of a square QR code, which is the most common that you will likely see. And then I also have an example here on our menu of a circular QR code. again, in a different color. Yeah, and you can also incorporate QR codes into a larger image or design for things, applications throughout your marketing strategy. All right.
And then I see one other that's come in about the type of data that you can collect and how to use it. I'll address the first part. The how to use it is probably a much larger question than we have time to address here, though we can follow up if anyone has interest in that. But in terms of the type of data that you can collect, so think of a QR code as basically a shortcut to a web destination or a URL. So you can append all kinds of information to that URL. You can use a customized URL. You can append UTM codes. So essentially, you can build things into the URLs that will allow you to identify the location where something was scanned, the day it was scanned, you know, the particular audiences that might have scanned it, and then track that back to through your analytics platform. So you've got a lot of flexibility with that. And then with some of the QR code generators, you've actually got the ability to go in and use a common QR code and change the destination URL in the background. So you're continuing to use one code, but it just redirects to different places as you change it.
All right. We've also got a question about different QR code generators that are available. So there are a few free versions and also some paid versions of these QR code generators, and they all kind of have different varying levels of customization tools. So I think the #1 search result you're going to get if you Google QR code generator is one called QR Code Monkey, which is a free service. This one does allow you to add things like logos and change colors and the resolution of your QR code as well. I've used this one myself, actually. There is also a generator called Flow Code, one word. They have a free version, and then they also have a more robust tier for the paid version, which is Flow Code Pro. There is also a paid service called Visual Lead, like visual and lead, but only one L in the middle, but one word. This is also a paid service, like I mentioned, and this is more design focused. And last example I've got is ScanNova, again, one word. This is very robust. It is useful for large campaigns and has a very broad feature set. Also, this was mentioned in one of the earlier questions. There is also a QR code generator built into the Adobe Design Suite. So you can create those within programs like InDesign while you're creating, larger images or different things for your marketing campaigns.